So let's get started. So today I'm joined by Jeremy Higgins from Higgins Agency Group to talk about employee leave. And this is a subject that I think has become more relevant to more employers since, COVID, because employees needed to take leave for COVID, maybe for the first time, and people were first introduced to the kind of nightmare landscape that this can become through that experience, unfortunately. So today, hopefully, we can provide you with some helpful information on basically what's required and some best practices and things to look out for as well. So my name is Emily Martin. I'm the owner and founder of Ally HR Partners. Basically, what we do is provide HR support and consulting services to small and medium-sized businesses. And I'll let you introduce yourself, Jeremy.
Yeah, Jeremy Higgins, president of Higgins Agency Group. Been in the consulting arena for 20 plus years now, specializing in all things employee benefits and insurance related. So Emily and myself work hand in hand together with a lot of mutual clients. So I'm excited to dive into some of the details today.
And Jeremy's my go-to guy for all things benefits. So for those of you looking to make a switch or something, I highly recommend it. Very helpful, and you will not be disappointed. All right. So before we get started here, just like a HR disclaimer, although we're going to cover a lot of information today and try to make this as helpful and as applicable to as many of you as possible across industries and sizes and things, this isn't an exhaustive presentation. There's no way we could possibly cover every little piece of nuance you really should know about leave. So please take a note of that. And basically, the moral of the story is going to be, if you're uncertain at all or realize that you know less about this than you thought, reach out afterward with questions, and I would be more than happy to help you with your individual circumstances, because there's a lot of information and there's a lot of ways to get in trouble with this leave stuff. So hopefully this is helpful, but not all inclusive. All right, so getting started here, I assume most people on this webinar will be joining us from New York State, or at least primarily located in New York State as an employer. So today we're going to focus on what the New York State required leaves are specifically. It can vary from state to state, but we're focusing on New York. So right now in New York State, there are obviously a growing list of leaves, as you can see here. There's FMLA, which any employers are subject to if you have 50 or more employees. That's a federal leave that's been around for a long time. Being in New York State, that's almost become a bit irrelevant to us, as we now have paid family leave, or PFL, which most people are familiar with. It's for employees who need to care for a loved one or who want to do child bonding after birth. There's disability leave, which has always been around, which is basically if an employee gets injured or is sick for non-work related reasons that you need to provide. Workers' comp, which is obviously work related. And then New York State paid sick leave, which is a little bit different, like paid time off that came out this year, and then other miscellaneous leaves. But today we're going to focus on mainly those big five: FMLA, PFL, disability, workers' comp. Those are long-term kind of leaves of absence for medical conditions or circumstances that require paperwork and long-term management, and that's what we're going to focus on today. There is a graphic on my website that breaks down what all these the required leaves are in greater detail than what's here. So if you want that detail, you can see it there, and we'll dive a little deeper here. Oh, and here's the graphic there for you. So again, this is free, available on my website, and you can find it there. All right, so the first leave we're going to talk about is FMLA. Really quick, we'll go through these. Most people probably are familiar with this, but if you have 50 or more employees, you are subject to require FMLA leave. Employees are eligible after 1 year of service, or about 1,200 hours of service. It's up to 12 weeks of unpaid but job protected leave. So that's really important to know that it's job protected. Qualifying circumstances for employees include family care, so care for a family member that's sick, an employee's own health condition that makes them sick and they have to miss work for, child bonding, and military leave purposes. This leave can be taken intermittently or continuously. So what that means is employees can take the full 12 weeks or however many they need based on their situation, or can be taken intermittently and actually as little as maybe even 1 hour increments here. So it gets a little tricky, but it's important to know that it can be either continuous or intermittent. If you are subject to this, note that intermittent FMLA abuse is a huge risk area and headache for businesses, because obviously it's very hard to track and manage if employees can take in hours. So be aware of that if you're subject to this. And this can always overlap with other leaves that qualify for similar circumstances, which we'll talk more about later, but that includes disability, FMLA, disability, and workers' comp. Yeah, sorry, my cat. I thought she was far enough away, but you can still hear her. So she's part of the experience. Someone just commented. All right. Jeremy, you want to talk about paid family leave?
Yeah, so let's talk about paid family leave, which really has only been a couple of years out now. We'll dive into this later in the presentation on how it affects with COVID, but let's just go back to the good old times pre-pandemic when we had just paid family leave. Paid family leave has increased each of the years. So when we got to 2022, we're at that maintained benefit now of up to 12 weeks of protected paid benefits through PFL. So that's significant time off, which has caused a lot of headaches for employers from a staffing point of view, because it's already hard enough to find and keep people on, let alone managing all these different claims. So 12 weeks. And what's unique about the PFL is it's not continuous, it's intermittent. So depending on my leave type, which I can trigger PFL based on bonding with a newborn, both mom and dad can use that. I can use that for caring for a sick family member, and sick family members are defined as spouse, children, parents, grandparents, grandchildren, as defined under New York State. So I got a wide breadth of people that I can help take care of for a serious medical condition. And then there's also the military leave, should somebody be deploying and going out. PFL is to be used in full day increments. So I can't use a couple hours here and a couple hours here like I traditionally can with PTO benefits. It's all or nothing for that day. So I can't double dip and get paid that day and also collect PFL. So the PFL carrier will specifically be looking for days that the employee is not paid by the employer. PFL will come in and pay that, and it will be 67% of your wage, up to the ceiling increases every year. So the ceiling for 2022 will be up to $1,068 per week. As we look at, as I mentioned before, for maternity, that really bodes into some problematics for staffing for companies, because PFL cannot be used the same time that you're on disability. But especially for maternity claims, which are usually the most prominent claims that we get under PFL, I have 6 to 8 weeks under disability leave, and then I can do 12 weeks continuous on top of that. So I can be looking at 16 to 18 weeks of protected leave and pay for an employee who goes out on leave. So this is funded through an employee tax. That's the easiest way to describe this. Okay, so this is not employer paid at the moment. It's not required to be. You as the employer are just the money mover. Okay, so everyone has the PFL that comes out of their wage. It's a percentage of their income, and it's capped. The cap ceiling was 78,000 and change in 2021. That's now 82,000, I believe, and change in 2022. Your payroll service will take care of calculating this tax automatically. It gets capped out. Everyone pays that percentage. So it's roughly, for those higher earners in the 80,000 range or whatever, it's up to $350 and change now in cost for PFL, whether you use it or not. But it's all funded. We all pay for it when we look at this actual process. And then your disability carrier bills you on an annual or quarterly basis, of which you square up and just pass that money along through them. With the recent rise in claims in PFL, I would not be surprised if we see significant price increase on this tax rate like we did in 2020 going to 2021. It was a 72% price increase. I think because of the pandemic, they held the line on the tax rate. So the tax rate in 2022 did not change, but I would expect significant increases in 2023 and possibly even further down the road, a possible employer contribution or kick in at some point, as obviously the claims pay out way more than premiums collected in these particular
A couple of notes I just want to add, Jeremy, is a couple updates. So for 2022, this year, PFL is equivalent, people can get it for up to 12 weeks, and 12 weeks used to be maxed at 60 days, which is 12 weeks times 5 days a week is what they assumed people worked.
Yeah.
That's increased to basically be whatever the employee's normal schedule is. So if you have employees that work on average more than 5 days a week, it could be 12 weeks times 6 days, or if they're working 7 days a week, more than that. So individual day amounts have gone up. And then in 2023, PFL is being expanded to cover sibling care as well as child and all that stuff. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. On top of anything else they might throw at us between then and now.
Yeah, exactly. All right.
All right, which leads us into the basically comparable coverage, which is the New York State short-term disability. So these are linked. These are on the same policy. These are with the same carrier. All right, the same coverage, just two different bucket of benefits that are mandated coverages in the state of New York. New York State disability leave, the benefit has not changed really since its inception. So this is for disability purposes for yourself only as the employee. Up to 26 weeks of pay at a whopping 50%, capped at $170 per week. So nobody's really living off of that benefit, but that's how New York State has that. So New York disability cannot be used in conjunction with PFL. We actually seen some people, especially for maternity, just forego their DBL leave and go right into PFL, which they have the right to do so. There is a 7-day waiting period in the state of New York when it relates to disability. So if I'm have a surgery, but I'm able to clear to get back to work less than 7 days, I'm not deemed disabled on a disability policy. It is continuous leave, so that I need to be disabled, 100% disabled in the state of New York. That's really important when you look at disability policies as it compares and contrasts to group disability policies. The New York State disability policy is all or nothing. I either can work or I can't work. If I can partially work, you're not going to be eligible for short-term disability benefits. Okay.
So the biggest difference here is disability is for an employee's own medical condition, non-work related, and PFL is for caring for a loved one with a medical condition or child bonding.
Yep.
Just to be clear. All right, workers' comp.
Yeah, workers' comp is the other one that goes hand in hand with required coverages in the state of New York. So if you have payroll with W-2 employees, you've got to have workers' comp, and you got to have your statutory disability, which includes your PFL. Workers' comp coverage, as we're all aware, is a joy in the state of New York, as we are one of the highest costing states for this type of coverage. It is driven based on your 4-digit class code of your employment of your employees. It protects your employees' wage and protects their employees' medical expenses, all right, not to be run through health insurance coverage, but the actual medical expenses themselves in the event an employee gets hurt through their involvement in work. So certainly in the state of New York, as far as I'm concerned, as an employer, you're guilty until proven innocent. When you look at these claims, and New York has a long way to go as far as enhancing these types of coverages, but this is mandatory. It is mandatory coverage. It is very expensive, and it can vary greatly as far as costs from company to company, depending on your claims and depending on your class codes and what your employees do. For audits, and I'm sure most of us have been through there, if you have an employee that does something in one class, maybe 8 hours a week, and the other 32 are a less risky class, New York State is going to throw the whole 40 hours into the most expensive class. So just be wary of that when you have people doing multiple jobs and things like that. Should you be subject to an audit, it is very hard to get those class codes changed once a state auditor comes in and classifies your employees.
All right. So brief summary on what the required leaves are. And again, that kind of summary doc is on my website. But let's kind of get what can people do, Jeremy, beyond what's required?
Yeah, so outside of those 3 required documents that we just talked about, really what we're seeing a lot of employers do now is offer supplemental offerings. So supplemental offerings can be say group short-term disability benefits, group long-term disability benefits. Studies have shown that when you have a strong disability product in place, that really cuts down on some of your workers' comp claims. Because we all know that some people get hurt on the weekend and they just make sure that they get themselves to the office on Monday and fall and call it work related because the employee knows that, hey, look, they're going to be covered under that stuff. All right. Where a strong disability policy where you can build something that's 60% income replacement, tax-free benefit, that can be something that's almost close to their take-home pay. And structure that where it can be employer paid, it can be employee paid, it can be a combination of the both. You can do it in unique formats like gross up and really some advanced things that you can do to make sure that you're taking advantage of tax savings on the way of structuring this group. So that's a great way to, number one, help curb maybe some of your potential workers' comp claims. Number two, to actually bolster the disability coverage. So when employees do need to go out, they're not just relying on that $170 that the state statutory policy gets out there. So it's a great way for employers to offer a big bang for a very low dollar impact to their employees. Certainly from a culture, benefit, retention, and attraction tool, you might be looking at something that could be $4 or $5 a week for an employee to protect their paycheck. Versus any other benefit that's out there, especially the health insurance, which can be very expensive when you look at those.
Yeah, and I know everyone's, on this call, like everyone right now is probably looking for ways to retain and better recruit staff. And I've made this suggestion to a few of my clients recently, especially in like the restaurant industry where there aren't a lot of benefits available to staff, and we've seen increased number of disability claims. That's not really, the supplemental disability isn't a great relevant benefit to employees coming in, but it certainly would breed loyalty once they get in there if they do get sick, because if they're staring down the barrel of $170 a week and you've provided them with the benefit that gets them more, that they're going to remember that, right? So I think that it's a great actual value add benefit to employees. We do have a question, Jeremy, that came in, and I'm going to kick it to you because you're probably better qualified than me. And I know it's different than disability, but if someone exceeds the 1 year mark of workers' comp, what does an employer do from there? If you could answer that quickly, how does that then proceed from there?
Yeah, from workers' comp point of view, I mean, somebody could be on comp forever, right? It's just a matter of the circumstance of what's happened. But as the employer required to maintain their benefits, maintain all those pieces that you have in place? No, the answer is no, you're not eligible though. That employee basically goes from an active employee to a leave of absence employee. So they're still kind of connected, right? Because the assumption is if that they recover from the injury, right, they're able to return for work. And we have to have reasonable accommodations to do so because they are in a protected class under New York State under a disability, is typically where an injury or workers' comp usually falls under that category. But as far as an employer maintaining benefits and things like that, we typically advise the following like FMLA rules, which is typically 12 weeks at most to protect, unless they're in some other protected class, where then you can actually shift somebody off to COBRA. If you needed to. So that's the general rule. Obviously, the individual circumstances of the particular claim or issue may dictate a different answer, but that's usually a good rule of thumb.
Yeah, and I think just on that note, for any of these leaves, those that are inherently job protected are FMLA and PFL mostly. Disability technically is not, although there's additional protections under the Disabilities Act. But generally, if someone's on a leave of absence for the FMLA period of 12 weeks or so, even if you're not subject to FMLA, it's a good rule of thumb for your business to use. After that, if the person aside from workers' comp, if the person has no expected return to work date and it's looking inevitable, you could terminate the employee at that time based on business need to fill the position and things. Again, definitely should review based on individual circumstance before doing anything with someone like myself or a lawyer. But that is a good question about leaves ending and people exhausting leave time. And there's one more question on this. If someone's out on workers' comp and then FMLA as well, if you make that one concurrent of 12 weeks, the workers' comp would continue to protect that person beyond the FMLA and without having to even get into ADA stuff, Americans with Disabilities Act. So workers' comp is a bit trickier, unfortunately, than like disability and other leaves. So. All right, let's keep going because I know we're short on time, and someone asked about COVID, which we're going to get to at the end.
Yeah, we'll get to that, Ron.
Yeah, I wish we didn't have to talk about it, but we do. Okay, so Jeremy, on that note, I think we covered some of this, right? What the supplemental options are.
Yeah. We did covered on that, right? Group short-term disability, group long-term disability. There's individual short-term disability products that are available. Think of the worlds of like the Aflacs and things like that. So one of the carriers that we work with, but they're crazy expensive because everybody knows who the duck is because they advertise everywhere. But you get into some really great group short-term, long-term disabilities. You're not talking very expensive costs. It's going to be driven based on your demographics. It's going to be driven based on the income of the employees that you're protecting, but you could see something as little as $30 or $40 a month to protect an employee's paycheck for the rest of their working career. That's a short-term and long-term disability combined together. And that's a pretty powerful message to an employee for retention. It's a pretty powerful message to an employee for recruitment to say that God forbid something happens to them, right? Their paycheck is protected for the rest of their working career, because short-term disability is usually going to cover you for the first 6 months. And long-term disability can take you all the way to Social Security disability retirement age. Okay. And again, other considerations, there's tons of ways that you can get really advanced in funding these through employer paid, employee paid, the taxability questions. You can make easy enrollment options where you don't have to chase apps. You can just enroll everybody, negative enrollments, all sorts of cool things that you can do for supplemental to really fill in some of the holes that we had just talked about of those mandated coverages that need to be in place.
Yeah, and I want to make 2 notes here before we move on. One, I think it's a good point. If this even keeps one person from, falsifying a workers' comp claim because they're smart enough to know that the benefit is so much greater for comp versus disability, you will more than have paid for this for like the entire existence of your business, I would think, right? Knowing what workers' comp claims can cost a business. So if you're looking for a cost benefit, that, seems like this is a no-brainer. And then I also want to point out, remember for this and any other benefits you have, whether it's, your medical, dental, vision, standard stuff, offering paid breaks, whatever they are, they're only as good as you communicate them. Right. So if employees have no idea that these benefits exist, that they're different, they're not standard, they're rich, they're available, then it's not going to help you in recruiting or retention. So just make sure this stuff is a part of maybe your job postings or your new hire packets, whatever it might be. Open enrollment every year, just throw all benefit information in there. Good reminder for staff. It's a common issue or a common loss of opportunity I see with clients and not communicating this stuff. All right, so now let's get into the more fun stuff, HR-y stuff. Sorry, Jeremy, your stuff's fun. But so this is kind of like the meat and potatoes of the value add part of this presentation, which is, beside from what's required and educating you on that, what are some best practices based on common risk and exposure areas? So there's a lot of ways to get in trouble with leave matters. First of all, you can, not communicate or offer the leave to employees when they're available for it. You are required to do that. You should have things in your handbook about this. There's posting requirements, but if someone comes to you with an issue and you know that there's a protected leave available to them, you really should be offering them the leave and giving them the paperwork. There's really specific protocol also for the time that you need to give employees to return that paperwork. You can't just say, okay, it's been a week, see ya. And usually 15 days is a good rule of thumb based on FMLA requirements. And then if they still haven't, you should give at least 7 days again after that. So make sure you know that there's a lot of nuance there. Benefit continuation, something I don't see clients consider all the time, but of course, if an employee is out on leave that isn't paid by you, right, a check is coming from the carrier in New York State, and they have some sort of benefit from you from like a medical standpoint or vision or dental, if the employer is normally paying a part of that premium cost out of their paycheck, of course, that's not going to happen while they're on leave because you're not giving them a paycheck. So that's something else to consider. That can be a huge financial hit to the business if all of a sudden you're inadvertently covering that portion of the employee's premium when they're out on leave because you're paying that bill and you're not collecting it back from them out of their check. So something else to consider. Retaliation for all New York State and now even federal laws, there's always a retaliation provision in there that says you're not allowed to retaliate against employees for exercising their rights. And in this case, it would be the rights to take leave. So certainly you never want to do anything that could be even perceived as being retaliatory because you're upset someone took leave. And then we mentioned the FMLA, the non-job protected disability leave. So even if someone exhausts their job protected FMLA or, for their own health condition and they don't have that job protection anymore, you probably should still consider what your requirements are under the Americans with Disabilities Act or the ADA to offer them continued leave as a form of a reasonable accommodation. So be careful about that. And then the other protocols, which we're going to dive into. So documentation and paperwork, we talked about being a big kind of area where there are some landmines. In general, all of this information you can find on New York State's website. So there's a great paid family leave portion of the New York State website where any and all information for paid family leave can be found. There's different packets for different circumstances. There's FMLA forms on the federal website. Most times you can Google things and find them. As long as it's the actual source website, you're pretty safe there. You can reach out to me or your carrier as well, including Jeremy. Your carrier should always have the paperwork as well. But make sure that you are submitting these for your employees. So the more control you can take of the process, the better. So best practice tip here, make sure your employees come to you and then you give them the paperwork, including letting them know when they need to return it by. And then you should have them give it back to you and review it yourself first, fill out your part as the employer, and then submit it to the carrier. Because otherwise the carrier could be getting incomplete information or incorrect information, and it's just a headache for you to try to correct that after the fact and not control the whole process. So definitely recommend.
I just want to chime in there. I can't emphasize how spot on that is when it comes to any of the claims regarding the comp, disability, PFL. Different carriers have different processes, different forms. They're constantly changing. So you want to make sure that you're working closely with your broker because your broker should have all the latest and greatest forms. There's wonderful tools. There's step-by-step instructions because the carrier, especially right now, they're so inundated with claims right now. They got one shot to look at this claim. And if there's missing information, it's going to go to the side and it's going to quickly get buried with all the other missing applications, which is going to delay everything. So the better you have a hand on submitting all the right paperwork the first time, the faster everything is going to follow through and less headaches for you and for your employees.
Yeah, and on this note too, I always have almost like a cover letter for clients, that one specifically for when the employee requests leave, and that communicates this is the leave you're requesting, these are the different types of leave you're available for. It communicates all your rules as an employer in terms of what leaves you're required to overlap, the payment of benefit premiums, all of those things. It's all in a one pager, clear as day, communicating their rights and responsibilities. And that goes along with the rest of the paperwork. And then when you designate the leave or when it's approved, a similar type of letter formally designating and once again communicating those responsibilities of the employee. That can save you so much money and time later. With just claims of whatever discrimination or non-compliance, you have it all documented right there. Definitely, if you're sending it via email, send it with a mail receipt and read receipt. If you send it via mail, send it certified mail to prove the employee got it. These are all things that can save your butt later in an incredibly huge way. And it just takes a little bit of time and to process and document all that stuff. So like everything in HR, documentation is key with this too. All right, so again, getting a little bit deeper into some best practices and things to consider. If you're going through this presentation and you realize you barely know what paperwork to use, let alone have any practices or policies established as a company and how you're going to do this stuff, this is definitely a priority I would set for yourself for this year. Just like everything, when it comes to HR, whether it's payroll or recruiting, you should have pretty well established documented policies and processes for this. So you're following the same rules each time and the same process each time. So there can't be claims of discrimination, but also just to save yourself, time and money and headaches. So if you haven't, you should develop leave policies and practices and procedures now. So some things that you want to consider when you're doing that are if an employee qualifies for multiple types of leave for their situation, what are you going to do about that? So a perfect example is if I fall outside on ice and break my leg, right? That would be obviously disability qualifying leave for me. And if I'm a 50 or more employer, that's FMLA. So in that situation, you would say we automatically designate FMLA with your disability because those two overlap and we require you to overlap them. That's perfectly acceptable. There's also situations where FMLA can overlap with paid family leave for child bonding, and for the birth of a child and all of that. So if you want to overlap, you should overlap. I suggest you require overlap because otherwise you're looking at stacking potentially in some cases, like for maternity, 12 weeks of FMLA, 12 weeks of PFL, and potentially 6 to 8 weeks of disability, which adds up to over 50 weeks of leave in a year for someone if they have a baby, which you don't want to have to account for in your business, right? So I would definitely consider that. As we talked about before, how you should determine how an employee is going to pay for their benefit premiums while on leave. So again, if they're not getting a paycheck from you, how are they going to submit that payment? Will you require it after they come back, which isn't always a great deal because there's no guarantee they will come back? Are they going to have to submit a check to you each week or month for that amount? But definitely decide that, communicate that upfront and put it in a policy. If an employee wants to use earned time off, so like PTO or sick time or vacation during their leave, will you allow that? One thing to consider is for any unpaid portion of the leave. So if it's the 7-day disability waiting period or just a straight up FMLA leave, not sure what that would even be anymore. But if there's any unpaid portions of the leave, you may want to decide whether you want to require employees to use any accrued time off or not for that time, or give them the choice. Or even let them supplement like their leave with paid time off. So disability is 170 a week. Maybe instead of that, they want to use paid time off. Will you allow that kind of thing? Let's see, will an employee be able to earn more time off or other benefits while on leave? So you should communicate that up front as well. So there aren't weird questions afterward or cases where you did it with one person and not another. You should probably have a policy that says either they can or can't participate in normal benefit earnings while on leave, time off. If you have like an annual dump time off where they get vacation on January 1st, should they earn that time if they're on leave during January 1st or not? You should decide that upfront as well. And then decide what you're going to do if the need for leave extends beyond the eligibility period. So if a, FMLA leave goes beyond 12 weeks or disability is beyond 26, how are you going to deal with that? Do you have modified return to work, modified duty policies? Will you allow that? These are all things you want to decide up front, so you're not making one-off decisions that could be discriminatory or considered discriminatory later. So all these questions really help you reduce the risk for compliance issues or discrimination claims like we talked about. It helps you mitigate some of the controllable factors related to leave for your business. So again, like, are you going to have to eat that benefits cost if you don't decide this up front? Is someone going to be able to take an insane amount of leave and then you're trying to figure out staffing and when the person will return? That obviously is a huge issue if someone's one person in a job, right? So if you require that overlap, you can shorten the amount of time someone could to take leave, right? Instead of 12 plus 12 plus 8 or whatever it is, it could just be a very singular period of time. And it just kind of lets you take control of the situation further when there are so many variables and it can be overwhelming and there isn't a lot of control. Lawsuits happen when there isn't consistent treatment in every part of your business when it comes to people. So the point here is to try to create some rules so you can be consistent about this. So any questions on these items? I know this is a lot of information and a lot to consider, and a little bit less of the black and white part of the presentation. Right, so either it was very helpful or very overwhelming because there's no questions. So we are kind of already covered this, but these are just best practice tips based on what we just talked about. Really make sure that you are developing procedures and policies up front, based on some of the suggestions we made today. Generic handbook inserts about FMLA and PFL do not count, and they are certainly not policies. Do you even know what is in them if someone made that handbook for you? So make sure you take some time and purposely do this work. I would again recommend overlap and requiring overlap of leave where possible. So again, FMLA really should be automatically designated with almost any other type of leave. FMLA, if you're subject to that as an employer, you wouldn't even need them to fill out the paperwork actually for that. You could just auto designate that if disability is approved, or if PFL that also qualifies as FMLA is approved, and so on. So I would just make that a standard practice as a best practice. I would require employees to use unearned but unused time off for any unpaid period of the leave. So this can help you reduce the liability you have later if someone returns to use their paid sick leave or whatever it is. I would just make them use that paid time off during the waiting period. And we talked about the benefit premiums a couple times. Establishing returning to work protocols would be a smart decision. You definitely should make sure they have clearance by their doctor to return to work, and consider a modified duty policy. Any questions about this stuff? All right. The one type of leave that also exists that we are not going to talk about today because it has been and it could still be a webinar on its own is New York State paid sick leave. There is a recording of a webinar from a long time ago, but it's still very relevant on my website. If you go to allyhrpartners.com/resources, you can watch it there. Hopefully you're complying with this because it's a year old now. But New York State paid sick leave, remember, is basically New York State's mandate of giving employees paid time off for when they're sick. Now for all employees starting in 2021. That's right. So hopefully you guys are accruing that for your staff and letting them use it. And that is above and beyond COVID paid sick leave, which we're going to talk about in a minute too, which I know is a common misconception.
Yeah,
So,
just real quick on the New York paid sick leave, just to hit a couple bullets on that for everybody, right? Is there only two methods, right? You either accrue it or you lump sum it. Everybody gets it, unless you're an employer that was already meeting or exceeding the state's mandate that you didn't have to add additional time. I know that's a very common question that we get on our end. Is this above and beyond the 2 weeks? Well, no, if you lump sum everybody 8 hours day one in the beginning of the year, you don't have to, add to that and make it a 3 weeks. It's just to make sure that this time is available to you within the state requirements of accruing at 30 hours worked is 1 hour gained as far as accrued for paid sick leave, or you just lump sum it and be done with it. So your payroll providers may be able to help do that. A lot of companies, I think, are just doing the lump sum to make it easier from an administrative point of view. But as Emily said, this is not COVID related. It just happened to be released during
but it can be.
pandemic. Yeah, during a pandemic, but this was slated to happen regardless of it. So we get a lot of questions there too, that this is specifically COVID related. No, this will be sticking around well beyond
forever. Yeah,
exactly.
Yep. And if you have vacation or other types of time off now, that's fine and could meet this requirement, but it does need to meet certain requirements that this law makes you have. So hopefully everyone's already done that and we're good to go there. So again, another disclaimer, if you didn't know about any of these leaves that we just talked about, or we said some stuff that threw up a red flag in your mind that you're not doing, or you think you might have done wrong, definitely take note and reach out afterward. And we're happy to help give you some direction on paperwork where you can find it or just best practices. But don't let it go on unaddressed because it can become a major issue. All right, so hopefully this is not why you're all here, but we kind of have to talk about COVID sick leave again. Hopefully this is the last time, but this is a factor when it comes to all of these other leaves and how it interplays. So Jeremy's going to explain it a little bit on this first slide.
And this is the latest and greatest information as of yesterday morning. And literally during this presentation, I just got notification that the mask mandate in New York has just been lifted for business and public places, effective for tomorrow, except. So more to come on that. So we'll just address how this works in that place. And I'll chime in 2 cents as I read the article as I was listening to Emily there. So let's talk about COVID leave. All right. This is a very confusing. I'm fielding like 10 questions a day on this, and it's okay because it's very confusing. All right. So let's just rewind real quick. Last year, right? Everybody thought, oh, the Federal CARES Act, COVID leave was super easy, right? Somebody said, hey, I don't feel good. Great. You get 2 weeks off. You pay them for 2 weeks. You got reimbursed by the federal government through Medicare tax reduction credit. Very simple. Well, that all ended on September 30th. So starting October 1st of 2021, New York State emergency COVID leave has been in place. That's actually been in place since March of 2020, but we had the Federal CARES Act that was a richer benefit, and that's what we've been using. So a lot of people just thought all of this leave was done and over with when the federal ended, and it's not the case. In New York, we have very specific rules that we have to adhere to, and this was part of Governor Cuomo's regime at the time that put these in, because this pushes an onus onto the employer that not all employers were aware of. So if you have 100 or more employees, okay, you're actually responsible for paying the first 14 calendar days. What does that mean, calendar days? It means you got to, within that 14-day window, you got to pay the employee for what they normally would have worked. If they don't get paid on a Saturday and Sunday because they don't work Saturday and Sunday, you don't pay them for those days, but those count as days, okay, actually used. You're responsible for the 14 days. This is above and beyond any vacation time, PTO time, the paid sick leave that we just talked about from New York State. It's basically an extra 2 weeks that you as the employer have to eat to cover an employee who has COVID, whether that's an order of quarantine, well, again, all the definitions and that stuff, or actually has COVID itself. For my mid-sized companies that are 11 to 99 employees, okay, or you were less than 10 with over $1 million in profits, revenue, I don't know why the cutoff is that, but what you do is it's 5 calendar days, okay? So 5 calendar days of job protected. So if I get COVID on a Monday, I'm paying them from Monday to Friday, okay? If I get it on a Wednesday, it's only gonna be 3 days, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, because Saturday, Sunday, if they're not normally worked, they don't count, but it's 5 days of paid normal wages during that time. If you're little group with under 10 employees and less than $1 million in revenue, okay, you don't have to pay anything above and beyond. It's just protected job status, okay, for an employee when they do that. So there's no end in sight on this. So this was passed in 2020, March 1st. Here we are today. I've scoured the website to see what updates that we had on any of this for 2022. And here's where things get really dicey. So when we talk about the headache, right, that this topic includes for people, the carriers are confused, the state's confused, everybody's confused. You get a different answer regardless of who you're talking to. So I will do my best to try and clear all of that up as it relates to New York, because New York is deferring to the CDC guidelines. Okay, the CDC guidelines for what does all this stuff mean? Because we have a difference between isolation and we have a difference between quarantine. Isolation, I got it. Okay. Quarantine, I was exposed to it. All right. So I want to run through these real quick because I think it's important. So if you've been exposed to COVID, okay, and you're not vaccinated, you are supposed to quarantine for 5 days. If you do not have any symptoms, I was just exposed, I'm supposed to quarantine for 5 days, and then I can return to work. And after those 5 days, for the days 6 through 10, I'm supposed to wear a mask. Okay. If I've been exposed and I've been fully vaccinated, I'm current, fully vaccinated in the eyes of New York means if I was eligible for a booster, I need to be boosted. Okay. If I'm in that category, I'm fully vaxxed. All right. I do not have to quarantine at all if I've been exposed to COVID. I don't have COVID. In all these scenarios, I've just been exposed. I don't have COVID. I've tested negative. Okay. Or I don't have any symptoms. All right. I'm just supposed to wear a mask around others for 10 days. If I've been exposed, I'm not vaccinated, but I've had COVID in the last 90 days, I am treated like a fully vaccinated person. So I've been exposed, but I've had COVID in the last 90 days. I don't have to quarantine. I just got to wear a mask around other for 10 days. Okay. Versus the positive tests, right? I test positive for COVID. I don't care if you're vaccinated or not vaccinated. It is a 5-day quarantine. Okay. 5-day quarantine to start, everybody, if you're test positive for COVID, whether you have symptoms or not. Okay. If you do not have symptoms, you can return day 6 and wear a mask around others from day 6 to day 10. Okay. And if you've had symptoms, okay, 5 days we start looking at, or can I return to work? You need to be fever-free for more than 24 hours. Okay. And your symptoms had to have gotten better. It doesn't mean you're better. It just means better as in they're not worse. All right. So it's hard to define all this stuff. But those are the CDC guidelines as far as when to quarantine, when to isolate, depending on if I've been exposed or if I've been actually been positive for COVID. That's important that I go through that stuff because that's how New York State is referring to that. Okay.
Right. And that determines how, based on what that need is, how it falls into these requirements of 14 days or 5 days determines what you need to pay people.
Right. So if we go to the next slide.
And I do want to point out all of that information about when to isolate or quarantine and for how long is on the Ally HR resources page on that website as well. And we're updating it regularly.
Okay. So when we talk about now PFL, I think we go back to 2 slides. I think there was a PFL. Is that good? Okay. Yeah.
Oh, you want to go back to the PFL slide?
No, that's fine. No, that's fine. I'll run with where we are on that. Okay. So as it relates to claims, right? So if you're a large group employer, 100 more employees, your employees technically should not be eligible for COVID leave above and beyond the 14 days. All right. Because it's an order of quarantine. Unlike under the Federal CARES Act, where it was loosey-goosey, under New York, we have to have an actual order of quarantine, okay, from a state or governing agency, Erie County Medical Department, those types of things. That's got to be submitted. All right. So a claim for COVID under the New York State emergency leave is no different than a disability. There's 3 parts. I got the employee portion, the employer portion, and the medical doctor portion, right? Somebody verifying that. I know this whole thing around home testing, is available. All your health insurance carriers now have to cover home testing. But as far as filing a claim, home tests do not count. They will not count. Someone needs to be able to prove that they're positive with COVID through a licensed medical provider. Like if you walk into one of those urgent care centers, immediate care, those types of things. Or if I go to one of those testing facilities that are licensed, they come in to do the PCR test, they mail you the results the next day. You have to use those in order to submit a claim. If you do not have that, the insurance carrier is not going to look at this. Okay.
Can I just point out and make really clear, Jeremy, what we're talking about in that it's not letting me go back here. So the required COVID paid sick leaves in New York State of either the 5 days or the 14 days of paid time, dependent on your employer size. That is only for circumstances where you, the employee yourself, have to miss time either because you're sick or you are required to isolate or quarantine because you were exposed. Mm-hmm. If someone needs more time beyond that paid time or beyond the paid time you're required to give them of that 5 or 14 days, that's when they can and should apply for this kind of hybrid New York State disability PFL benefit if they're required to isolate or quarantine longer and you don't have to already pay them.
Right. Correct. So this is different than when things were a few months ago, 14 days, which then got revised to 10 days. So now in most cases, the quarantine period under the CDC is 5 days. So people that need to be out for 5 days, the likelihood of them being able to get paid under PFL or disability It's all going to be specific to those conditions, and we got to make sure all the pieces are in place, all right, for the order.
There's probably very few circumstances where this will be relevant, right, Jeremy?
It's getting less and less now. So even the carriers themselves are struggling with this. Is we have some claims in process right now for some of our clients that we've submitted that under those rules. And even I have two departments within the same carrier arguing with each other on the interpretation of what it means. Should it just be disability? Should it just be PFL? Should it be both of this? So I've gone through the roundtables 2 weeks ago and had executive meetings with all the biggest carriers that handle the statutory disability policies to get their take on this and to get their process, because it's just been a disaster as far as getting claims, getting people paid properly, getting things kicked back. So at least for our clientele going forward, we now have direct channels to our carriers to help expedite this for these claims, to make sure that these are getting done on a timely basis and getting processed with the right information up front so we can get through this. So,
and I do think though that something that is super common and relevant is this above the COVID paid sick leave that New York requires for the employee themselves, is this leave someone might need if their kid has to isolate or quarantine, right? I think that it's just going to continue to be a problem.
Yeah. So going back to a kid, right? If my kid is isolated under order of quarantine, all right, from a government agency, all right, and I'm the caregiver for that kid, all right, or my kid has COVID, okay, I'll be able to use PFL for that circumstance, right? If it's just minor care, like my kids' schools closed because of COVID, that doesn't count, right? Because there's too many exposures, those types of things. It's related to the medical care of the actual child for state to get to use this. So I expect some updates, and I expect this to kind of shrink and maybe some of these benefits tailor off, but it's not as wide of a breadth as it used to be because the CDC has cut its guidelines down to where it was. So that's very confusing to many people, because again, information you might have 2 months ago is totally different than where the information is now today as we check that. So a lot of moving parts when we talk about this particular piece.
Yeah, I think the moral of the story here is just there is still required paid time off of it, required to be paid by employers for employees who miss time for COVID, whether it's them being sick, them needing to isolate or quarantine, their kid being sick or needing to isolate and quarantine, or the vaccination leave that's out there too, which we're not talking about here, but that is still required.
All right. And then the other question I think that comes up a lot is now we're starting to see second cases of COVID, right, for people getting it a second time. So under New York State rules, it specifically says like this can only be triggered 3 times. All right. The first time is for a quarantine only, where you don't have COVID. You would just been under a mandated order. And then the other 2 and 3 times is COVID once, COVID twice. That's it. After that, you've exhausted all of your New York benefits. From an employer point of view, everything that we read, this is a big argument of contention too. Everything we've read from the employer, it's not the 5 or 14 days per occurrence. It's one time from the employer point of view. So that's a big thing too, right? So if I got COVID again, right? It's no longer on the onus of the employee. There's got to be a lot of documented information for the carrier, and the carrier is going to make the final determination now if they're going to be paid or not. If they're not paid, the employee can use paid sick leave that we just talked about for 30 seconds prior, or they can use PTO time or unpaid leave. It goes through. Employer's not going to be obligated to do so unless you have a policy that says otherwise, where you're going above and beyond the state mandates.
Mm-hmm. So still a lot there, and probably still more to come.
Yeah, still more to come. So to actually file a claim, there is now New York last month released a specific COVID claim. It's a PFL claim form because they are the same policies, but they're often 2 different departments at the insurance carrier, depending on the insurance carrier that you're working with and who processes what. So it's important to make sure that it's the right claim form, that it's the PFL COVID claim form to be used, which this link here that Nail has up there, there is a claim form that's a generic one. I just recommend you use the one that's specific to the carrier, which will all look the same. It just got the carrier information specific to your employer in there. So it'll make it a smoother transition for employees. But as we get into the exhausting of the quarantine order, that's definitely something that's going to be looking at. Because here in Erie County gave up. they gave up on tracing at one point when we were at our peak last month, and said, well, here's a form, you quarantine yourself. So our carriers are scratching our heads going, can we use that or not? Because the state just gave everybody the quarantine form to complete. So that's been a bone of contention as well. So I wish I had more solid answers and it was black and white and this is exactly how it works. But there's a lot of nuances between who got COVID, what the circumstances of the COVID claim is, how many times have they been out, how long have they already been out for COVID claims. So each case is almost individual, and we got to look at those circumstances to best guide on how these are going to be paid out going forward. But hopefully,
Yeah, proceed with caution, I guess, like everything, right? And if you're unsure, reach out, because certainly there's going to be a landslide of claims. Probably the DOL will be handling from a wage and hour division standpoint, I would assume, because this is like a paid time off benefit that an employer would be violating if they didn't pay this.
Yep.
In terms of the straight COVID paid sick leave. So, and we all know the wage and hour division is a huge money making division for the New York State DOL. So make sure you're not denying this, the paid COVID sick leave when you're required to give it.
Exactly.
And just some other checkpoints with that. You remember you have to provide COVID paid sick leave for employees haven't exhausted that. So if they've already taken it multiple times for having COVID, obviously they can't get it anymore, nor should they need it, but make sure you're providing it. You cannot make employees apply paid sick time or, regular paid sick leave or other kinds of earned paid time off like vacation or PTO if they still have that New York State COVID sick leave available. So make sure you understand that needs to be exhausted first. It's unfortunate because it's an added cost to the employer that they can't recoup now through the FFCRA stuff, but it is what it is. Employers may allow employees to use other paid time off for any portion of COVID leave that is unpaid. So if you have to provide 5 days as a smaller employer and the person is sick beyond that, you can let them use other paid time off if they want. If you mandate an employee to receive a negative test to return to work, so say they get through the 5 days of quarantine and you don't feel comfortable having them come back and you want them to get a negative test. If that takes a little long to get beyond that 5 days, or, it comes back positive, even though they're not symptomatic and things, if you make them stay out longer for whatever reason, New York State does say you have to pay them for that additional time. So even if you were required to pay for 5, it's based on your own rules above and beyond CDC's. You create a scenario where they have to stay out longer, you do need to pay for that time. So definitely consider that you may not want to do that anymore. And take back some control here. You can require proof of positive test results to take these leaves. If you're not now, I definitely would make sure you are moving forward, where you can, again, take back control and mitigate some abuse. If there is any, you want to make sure that you do that.
And just real quick, no different than actually submitting the claim. So assuming somebody is going to be out for 10 days for whatever reason, you have the right to ask for all that information in advance to prove that somebody's out. A home test kit's not, because eventually you got to be prepared to submit a claim if this does go beyond your 5 days or 14 days, depending on your size employer.
Yep. And make sure you're tracking this, guys. So if you don't have a special pay code in your payroll system to differentiate between New York State paid sick leave, New York State paid COVID leave, and all the other things, you're doing yourself a disservice because we all thought this was going to last a short amount of time, but it obviously has gone on and on. And so, if this continues in the future, you want to make sure you understand whether someone's actually eligible for more COVID paid sick leave the next time they claim to need to be required to isolate or quarantine. Also, if you ever have someone make a claim they didn't get their time and needed it, or there's a random audit, you want to be able to show the DOL or whoever's coming in that you really did comply. So super easy to set up those pay codes in your payroll system. Make sure you do it and make sure that you're spending the extra little bit of time to actually track why people are getting paid time off. And remember, yes, you shouldn't be coding anything as the FFCRA or CARES Act or whatever, version of it you were calling it in your system any longer, because that's no longer available, unfortunately. And then really quickly mention this other required COVID time off, just wrapping up COVID. There is the vaccine leave up to 4 hours. Yes, that's above and beyond everything else we talked about. 4 hours of paid time off per dose. you can push back a bit on whether the employee actually needs to go during work time. They should be able to at least do it at the beginning of the day or before they come and miss only 1 hour, or at the end of the day, but you still have to pay that. And then there is the vaccine recovery. There is no specific leave for that, but you do need to let them use paid sick leave for vaccine recovery if they're sick. Getting to the end here, COVID is never ending in this presentation or our lives. COVID leave takeaways. Remember, working from home disqualifies a person from any of that COVID paid sick leave. So if you can get creative and have the person work from home, barring they're not too sick to work, have them work from home so you don't have to pay that sick leave. There's a little order of operations chart here for, COVID sick leave exhausting, then using the DBL, PFL benefit or disability, and then additional time off, and then PTO or sick time. So you'll be getting a copy of this, but that's a good rule of thumb as well. Do not mix up New York State paid sick leave, which is required for any type of sick time forever, basically now, and COVID paid sick leave, which is just for the specific COVID situation. They are separate. You have to pay and offer both of them. Do not mistake those things. I know Jeremy sees that a lot, and so do I. Unfortunately, they were launched in the same year at the exact same time, which didn't help, but they are different. And as I mentioned, if you're required to miss work, if you're requiring people to miss more work because of COVID, you should be paying them. And then again, documentation. As I mentioned, all of the COVID quarantine and paid sick time requirements are updated on my website, Ally HR Partners /resources. So make sure if you're unsure and you have a situation come up, check there. That's updated to the latest and greatest by New York State and the CDC. We kind of talked about this already. Make sure you're using your system well to track this time. I won't cover any more time here, but your payroll provider should be able to do this for you. So set up those separate pay codes to monitor and manage leave usage, whether it's COVID or even whether it's FMLA and disability and all those things we talked about. You can, in some cases, do that in those systems as well. For that regular leave, if you don't use a payroll system, use an Excel spreadsheet, but you have to make sure to track the usage because you don't want to get to a point where someone's exhausted their eligibility, but you have no idea how much they've used. And now it's really difficult to make any decisions about letting them go or whatever it might be, because you can't tell if you owe them more job protected time, right? So make sure that you're tracking it for yourself and your own business protection. If you take away nothing else about leave, so again, whether it's the leaves we talked about in the beginning or the COVID leaves, you need to know what your obligations are. So make sure you understand that first and foremost. Have a plan for how to manage and administer them. Set policies and procedures, have all your paperwork in check, know what you're going to send, but make sure that you have a plan to avoid claims of discrimination or inconsistency later. Ask questions, tread lightly, don't assume. So you should handle all of these leave scenarios like a loaded, grenade with the pin taken out of it, right? Like you never know where they're going to go. And if you make one misstep, it could be a big claim later. So reach out to your providers like Jeremy or someone like myself, or if you want to pay extra money, reach out to your lawyer. But make sure that you're always asking questions and, tread lightly and don't assume that everything's fine and you know all the answers. Always err on the side of the employee's benefit. So if you are going to assume something, make sure it's the most beneficial thing to the employee to avoid claims. Document, like we said, and be aware and beware of discrimination and retaliation exposure. So like we said, you cannot retaliate. That also means your managers can't retaliate. So you better make sure your managers know that even if someone took leave and it upset them, they can't be making snide comments or jokes or scheduling them on worse shifts when they get back. Those are all things that could be retaliation claims later. So make sure your managers are trained and you know about that provision as well. Manager training is always a good idea on this and other topics, I would say. You can subscribe on my website to get updates on this stuff, but just all their employment related matters, and find resources on my website, which I already mentioned. Here's a little summary on my business. I know we're getting to the end of the time here, so I'll speed through this. But if you do need HR help in general, that is what we do. So please reach out with questions and we'd be happy to help. And Jeremy, I'll let you close out your part and then we can answer some questions.
Yeah, no, thanks. Just to recap, as far as our areas of expertise, really anything, benefits and compliance related as it relates to your employee benefits is what we really, strive and help our clients with. So thank everybody for their time. I know we're a couple minutes over here, but certainly want to open the floor to questions. I tried to address a couple in the chats while you were talking there at the end. So I think we can open the floor and see if anybody has anything else they want to dive into.
The vaccine leave required by New York State does also apply to boosters. Yeah, so you do need to pay employees to get the booster if they want to. 4 hours per dose. Yeah, so boosters, that would be 1 dose. Any other questions at all? We will be sending a recording of this, and we also will be, we'll send the slide decks too. So if you don't feel like watching us again and hearing us, you can read it for yourself. And feel free to pass on and share along with anybody that you think might help. It might help. Otherwise, thanks so much. This was like our best attended webinar yet. So everyone have a great rest of your day. Enjoy the sun, enjoy the maskless life we're all going to live starting tomorrow.
Exactly. Well, thank everybody again. Happy to help. Should any other questions come up, please let us know. But I think nothing else is in the chat here. So you can always reach out to us directly afterwards. Something pops up. Both Emily and myself are available to help anybody. So thank you all for your time.
All right. And thanks, Jeremy, for joining me.
All right. Thanks, Emily, for having me.
All right. Bye, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.